For most of human history, the most valuable thing on Earth wasn't gold, silver, or land. It was flavor. A handful of dried seeds, a pinch of bark, a drop of resin. These were the treasures that could make or break empires. It sounds absurd today in a world where spices sit in neat rows on supermarket shelves, but for nearly 1,000 years, peppercorns were worth more than gold. Nutmeg could buy you a house. Cinnamon could pay off a lifetime of debt, and entire nations were willing to kill, conquer, and risk everything just to control where these flavors came from. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. Before the modern world existed, before the United States, before global stock exchanges, before oil pipelines, the economy ran on spices. Not just because they made food taste better, but because they solved problems people could not solve in any other way. Spices preserved meat, disinfected wounds, masked rot, treated illnesses, lifted social status, and signaled wealth in a way nothing else could. In medieval Europe, a dish scented with cinnamon or cloves wasn't just food, it was a statement that you lived above the frozen monotony of everyday survival. In a world of scarcity, spices were the closest thing to magic, and because of that, they became money, they became power. Picture Europe in the 12th century, cold, gray, isolated, and profoundly bland. Most people never traveled more than a few miles from home. Their diets were monotonous, their winters long. Fresh food was rare. Preserved food tasted like the inside of a cellar. Yet nobles held feasts sprinkled with exotic spices that came from lands they'd never see. Spices carried on the backs of traders who crossed deserts, mountains, and oceans. A single pound of pepper could buy livestock. A pouch of saffron could be traded for weapons. These weren't luxuries, they were assets, and Europe wanted more of them. But getting spices into Europe required navigating one of the most sophisticated, secretive, and profitable supply chains the world had ever seen. Spices didn't grow in Europe. They came from the far edges of the known world, from the Malabar coast of India, the Banda Islands of Indonesia, the mountains of Sri Lanka, and the forests of Southeast Asia. To reach Europe, they traveled through a delicate relay of merchants, Indian traders to Arab intermediaries to Egyptian ports to Venetian ships. Each group added its markup, each link guarded its secrets. The further a spice traveled from its origin, the more myths merchants invented to protect their roots. According to medieval rumor, cinnamon grew in giant bird nests guarded by monsters. Nutmeg came from islands surrounded by dragons. Pepper grew in forests so dangerous that farmers had to burn them down, blackening the peppercorns in the flames. These weren't innocent stories, they were trade secrets, early corporate misinformation campaigns designed to maintain monopolies. And at the end of this global relay stood Venice, the unexpected financial center of the medieval world. Venice didn't grow spices, it didn't control the source. What it controlled was the bottleneck, the point where goods entered Europe. By the 13th century, Venice had built a near monopoly on importing pepper and other valuable spices. Its merchants were the original price setters, manipulating scarcity, hoarding supply in warehouses, and releasing shipments only when profits peaked. The wealth from this trade turned Venice into a city of marble palaces, gilded ceilings, and naval power. It was the first European state to become rich not through land, but through logistics, through controlling flows rather than fields, a model many modern corporations still follow. But domination breeds desperation. The more Venice tightened its grip, the more Europe began to look for ways around it. And this is where our story begins to drift westward, toward the Atlantic, toward the unknown, toward the place that would eventually become the Americas. Not because Europe wanted new continents, not because explorers dreamed of discovery. Europe went west for one reason: to beat the spice monopoly. Columbus didn't cross the ocean looking for a new world. He crossed it because he believed he could reach Asia, the land of pepper, faster by sailing west. He was wrong, but his miscalculation reshaped history.
Vasco da Gama sailed around Africa not to explore, but to break the Arab monopoly. Magellan circumnavigated the globe because Spain needed its own path to the Spice Islands. Every voyage that launched the so-called Age of Exploration began as a financial maneuver to secure cheaper spices. Empire followed profit, geography followed greed, and when Europeans reached the Americas, something unexpected happened. The world discovered a second wave of spices, new, potent, transformative chili peppers, completely unknown to Asia before 1492, spread across the Eastern Hemisphere at lightning speed. Within decades, Indian curries, Sichuan cuisine, and Korean dishes transformed. Vanilla, a Mesoamerican treasure, became one of the most valuable commodities in Europe. Cacao, once used as money in Aztec markets, became a luxury drink for European elites. Allspice, grown only in Jamaica and Central America, became a prized preservative and medical ingredient across Europe. Suddenly, the New World was no longer a curiosity. It was a new economic engine, a second spice frontier. And this meant something profound for global history. The Americas, which had been isolated from Afro-Eurasian trade networks for millennia, were now irrevocably pulled into the global economy. This moment, the merging of old and new world commodities, marks the true beginning of globalization. But to understand why American spices mattered so much, we need to rewind a few centuries back to the world they were about to disrupt. Before chili peppers remade Asia and vanilla conquered Europe, the global economy was already dominated by a single machine, the medieval spice route. A tightly controlled supply chain where farmers earned pennies, middlemen earned fortunes, and Venice built an empire without a single plantation. This was the system the New World collided with and eventually overturned. The medieval spice route was more than just a trade network. It was the first genuinely global supply chain. Every step along the way was engineered to maximize profit, protect secrets, and maintain power. From the Malabar coast to the Red Sea to the Venetian docks, spices passed through dozens of hands. But the people who touched them were not equal. At the source, farmers earned almost nothing. By the time the same peppercorn reached a banquet table in London or Paris, its price had multiplied 100-fold. It was one of history's earliest and clearest examples of value extraction. And the key players understood that power wasn't about distance, it was about choke points. If you controlled a strait, a port, or a narrow channel between islands, you controlled the flow of wealth. Arab merchants dominated the Indian Ocean because they mastered the monsoon winds and the ports of Aden, Hormuz, and Jeddah. Venice dominated Europe because it controlled the Adriatic and had the diplomatic muscle to negotiate exclusive trading rights with Egypt. It didn't matter that Venice was small, it mattered that Venice sat at the end of the funnel. This system worked beautifully until it didn't, because like every monopoly in economic history, it created the incentive for bypass. The higher Venice pushed prices, the more desperate Europe became to break the chain. And in the 1400s, that desperation turned into action. Portugal went first. Its princes were not interested in exploration for glory or science. They wanted pepper. Pepper was the most traded spice in the world, the bloodline of European cuisine, and the single biggest profit maker in medieval commerce. If Portugal could cut out Venice, if it could go straight to the source, it could rewrite the balance of power. Vasco da Gama's journey around Africa was a technological revolution disguised as navigation. Europeans had never successfully crossed the Indian Ocean, but in 1498, da Gama reached Calicut, the beating heart of the spice trade, and what he discovered was infuriating. The spices he believed were guarded by dragons and mystery were stacked openly in warehouses, priced cheaply, and traded casually. The merchants of India had been selling spices for centuries. It was only Europe that lived under the illusion of scarcity. Portugal didn't respond with humility, it responded with force. Within decades, Portuguese fleets blockaded ports, raided ships, and imposed brutal taxes on traders. Their goal wasn't to participate in the spice trade, it was to dominate it. They built forts along the coasts of Africa, Arabia, and India. They seized choke points like Malacca. They bombarded cities that resisted, and they reshaped the Indian Ocean into a militarized marketplace where every ship needed Portuguese documents to sail. But Portugal's empire was too small to hold the system forever, and from the north came a new competitor with sharper instincts, more capital, and far less patience: the Dutch. The Dutch Republic in the 1600s was a tiny country with a giant ambition to become the center of global commerce, and spices were the key. But the Dutch approached the problem differently. They didn't just want to seize ports, they wanted to industrialize control. In 1602, they founded something the world had never seen: the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, or VOC, the Dutch East India Company. The VOC wasn't a government, it wasn't a guild, it was a corporation with shareholders, dividends, legal rights, and critically, the authority to wage war. It could sign treaties, build forts, mint coins, execute prisoners, and govern territories. It was the first multinational